I think you stand over here.
What, here? No. Here? Right. So shall I introduce this? It's not part of the timing, just introduce it and then I'll begin if you like. So I'm just going to say a few words.
It's okay. Not time. Yeah.
Are we all ready, camera people?
I don't have you. I do.
Are we all ready? Good afternoon at Speaker's Corner. Today is Easter Sunday, and
hooray!
And churches throughout the world are proclaiming a simple three-word message: Christ is risen. The Pope did it this morning. My good Christian friend here has been doing it this morning. All the churches throughout the world have got the same message: that a man 2,000 years ago rose from the dead on this Sunday, not on Good Friday, not on Saturday, but on this day 2,000 years ago. And as a Muslim, I obviously want to offer my reflections on that, because I don't believe that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. I don't believe the scriptures foretold it, and I don't believe it happened historically. But anyway, sorry, I'm now entering into polemics, so I'll now draw a line over that. That's it, end of my introduction. And I've now got 5 minutes, we've agreed beforehand. Well, I'll give my bit, and then my good friend here will give his response. I'm very liberal about this. If he wants more than 2 minutes, I'm not going to complain about it, to be honest.
So essentially what I am suggesting is that he'll do 5 minutes advancing his case, and I'll take 2 minutes just critiquing his case. He'll do 5 more minutes on his case, 2 more minutes critiquing, and then I'll take my 5 minutes advancing my case where he can critique only for 2 minutes, and then 5-2. So it's 5-2, 5-2, and then 5-2, 5-2.
And Douglas has a PhD in mathematics. If none of that is clear, he will make that clearer for us.
It's a long time ago. I've forgotten it all.
Useless. He's fired. He's fired. Go away. Right, are we ready? Action and yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Go. Okay. So I just want to share with you what the earliest first-person witness to the resurrection of the appearance of the resurrected Jesus tells us. This comes in a letter from St. Paul in the letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 3 onwards. Now, here's the earliest first-person account.
Why have you got that bit highlighted in yellow, Mr. Speaker?
Oh dear. First-person account we have in the Bible of a resurrection appearance. And I want to tell you what he said before we go on to other matters. And he says this: "For I hand on to you as of first importance what I in turn received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures."
I don't think that's the King James version, is it?
And then he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to someone untimely born, he appeared also to me, for I am the least of the apostles. So he says, out of that long series of appearances, he also appeared to Paul. Now my point is this today. I'll make 2 essential points really. One is, where in the Scriptures, now what are the Scriptures? The Scriptures are the Jewish Bible. It begins in Genesis, goes all the way up to Malachi in the Protestant Bible.
It's not called Bible, it's called Torah.
Okay. And I want to know where...
Jesus isn't his name, by the way.
Okay.
Jesus is Greek. It means son of Zeus.
Thank
Jesus.
you. Thank you. Right. You're very learned.
Thank you.
Can I just try my own poor way to
Joshua,
continue?
son of Joseph.
Right.
Yehoshua ben Yusuf.
Although I'm not as learned as this man, I will continue in my own poor way to have a go at this debate.
You're very modest, Paul.
I'm also being sarcastic. Come on, you recognise that. Just give me 10 extra seconds for the interruption. Well, okay. My point is this: where in the Jewish Bible, that includes the Torah and the prophets and the writings, does it say that the Christ, that's the Messiah in Hebrew, would die for sins and then be raised on the third day according to the Jewish script? That's what it says in here. That's my first question to any Christian, to this gentleman here. Where does it say the Messiah would die and be raised on the third day? That's my first question, my first point, if you like. And secondly, what about the resurrection appearances themselves? This is what Paul says of them in Acts. And he's talking to King Agrippa. He's been arrested, he's going off ultimately to Rome to be martyred. And he says, "After that, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision." This heavenly vision, if you look at the preceding verses, refers to the appearance of Jesus on the road to Damascus, where Jesus appears to him and says, "Why are you persecuting me, Paul? I'm Jesus." Paul calls the appearance of the resurrected Jesus to him a vision, a heavenly vision. Now the people who were with him saw nothing. An important point of evidence. The resurrected Jesus appears to an apostle of God, and the apostle himself, the people who were with him, saw nothing. And remember, this is supposed to be a bodily resurrection, a resurrection from the dead. And yet no one saw anything apart from Paul, who had a heavenly vision. So I would maintain, and remember the Gospels were written, how much longer? The Gospels were written maybe 40, 50, 60 years after Paul said they were heavenly vision to King Agrippa. They were written much, much longer afterwards, where I would argue the story had become embellished, had developed, had become mythologized. So what started off as a vision, like the vision of Mary or the vision of whoever, Vishnu, whatever you want to call it, people had visions all the time in religious history. Even today people have visions. I'm not doubting that Paul had a vision, but this is the resurrected Christ that we are celebrating today. And it was a vision, the people with him saw nothing. So I maintain that it started off as a vision. It became, in the retelling of the story, year after year, decade after decade, eventually, when it was set down in the Gospels, of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, it became a very physical story. But it wasn't originally. So my twofold challenge is, where does the Jewish Bible say the Messiah would die and be raised on the third day? Because I have read all of the Bible, every book of the Bible a number of times. I've personally never come across this. Maybe this learned brother can put me right today and show me where it says that. And secondly, does he agree with Paul that the resurrection appearances were in fact visions initially, and as the story got told they became physicalized, embellished, mythologized? And I'm going to give up my last 30 seconds. I've said what I want to say. Over to you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paul, for this opportunity. So Paul has raised two specific points in regards to resurrection. The first point he has raised is that, of course, the New Testament talks about Christ having died and Christ rising up on the third day according to the Hebrew scriptures. So Paul's challenge is, where in the Hebrew scriptures do you find the resurrection having been prophesied, and especially the resurrection on the third day?
That's right.
All right. The answer is pretty simple, and the answer has been provided quite explicitly in the book of Acts. In the preaching of Peter, in the book of Acts, chapter 2, Peter quite clearly talks about this. Acts chapter 2, verse 27, where Peter refers to an Old Testament prophecy which says, "For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence." So Peter answered our Paul's question, a long time ago, soon after resurrection. But Peter points out to a prophecy which is in the book of Psalms. In the book of Psalms, chapter 16, verses 8 to 11, where the psalmist says, "I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not leave my soul in Sheol." That's the prophecy.
So which psalm is that? Sorry. Psalm which 15?
16.
16, beg your pardon. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. So, prophecy about resurrection right there. Jonah, third day, coming back from Sheol. Two specific prophecies put together on the third day resurrection in the Old Testament. Paul, now I haven't got much time, just a few more seconds if I may take. This our Paul essentially said, Apostle Paul just had a vision. I have a problem. I have many points in regard to that, but I'll just raise one point for the lack of time here, which is, how can a vision blind a person? Paul was blinded, and the blind Paul was taken into the city, and when he was inside the city, when he was prayed, scales fell off his eyes. Now, is that a vision? Or is that a real blindness with a real scale falling off his eyes for him to regain his sight? Very important. Not a spiritual vision, but a physical reality in Paul's life. Blindness followed by scales falling off, followed by being able to see again. Physical resurrection is what, physical experience is what Paul had. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for that. Are you ready? Yeah. Psalm 16, let's have a look at it. I've got it's not a Muslim Bible, by the way. This is The Holy Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, it's the standard academic Bible which I used at university when I was studying the New Testament, recommended by most academics in Britain and America recommend this translation, the most accurate translation. Let's look at Psalm 16. It says, a Psalm of David. So we know that the speaker here is David. He says this. Remember the question, by the way, where does it say in the Jewish Bible that the Messiah, or the Christ, would die and then be raised again on the third day? Have that statement in the forefront of your minds, and let's see if it is found in Psalm 16, as my good friend here says. So that's the challenge. Let me read it to you in this very good translation of David. Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to God, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the holy ones in the land, they are noble, in whom is all my delight. Those whom choose another God multiply their sorrows. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their names upon my lips. The Lord is upon my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I have a goodly heritage. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night he instructs me. I keep the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. For you do not give me up to Sheol, or let your faithful one see the pit. You show me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. End of Psalm. End of Psalm. Where does it say in that Psalm that the Messiah would die and on the third day be raised again from the dead? It doesn't mention a Messiah. No one actually dies in this. It is, you have not abandoned me to Sheol. It's a poetic figure of speech. It doesn't say he'd be risen again on the third day. It certainly doesn't say, as Paul also says of the scriptures, that it says the Messiah would die for sin. It doesn't say that either. So I'm afraid that this challenge has not been met so far. It doesn't mention a Messiah, death, 3 days, or resurrection, or anything else. It's just David saying, thank you, God, for being faithful to me. It's a great psalm and nothing to do with Christian belief, in my view. Secondly, to come back to the resurrection appearances, these are supposedly are physical bodily appearances, as solid as we are here today, where you can actually touch and see the physical Jesus. And yet, according to the earliest account we have, the people who were with Paul, the Apostle Paul, saw nothing as Paul was having the vision of the resurrected Jesus. This is damnable evidence that the earliest resurrection appearance was not a physical appearance. It cannot have been physical unless anyone or everyone else was blind in the first place. So I come back to the 2 points I made. I've yet to hear a prophecy in the Old Testament that Christ died on the third day, rose from the dead. And why did no one in Paul's entourage see anything? You mentioned the scales falling by the light. That's not my point. The point is, it was a physical bodily resurrection. Why did no one see with Paul a physically bodily resurrected Jesus? You would expect to see it if it was a bodily resurrection. So I'll give up my last 2 minutes because I've said my piece.
All right. Paul, our friend Paul here, seemed to undermine King David so much. Any Jew who would know about the Messiah would very, very strongly object to that. Because Messiah, according to Jewish scriptures, is seen as a Davidic king. Messiah, according to Jewish scriptures, as a matter of fact, by Jews today even, the Messiah himself is actually called as David or Davidic Messiah also. In other words, the Messiah is very, very tightly seen with David, King David himself. Now, adding to that, let's read specifically the two verses I care about in this regard, which is verses 9 and 10, where David saying something which doesn't really apply to his life directly. Let's see what he says. My flesh also will rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Sheol. David says his soul will not be left in Sheol. And then he goes on, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. Which Holy One was David himself talking about? If the Holy Messiah is much more than David, and David is, let's say, a top guy in Jewish ideas. The point is this, My dear friends, David is referring to the one above him, the one far more superior to him, who is the Messiah himself. Talking about the Messiah, he says, the Holy One will not see corruption. What is he talking about? Even if his body dies, the body will not completely be corrupted, but it will come back. That was David's point. I can't see why our friend Paul here doesn't see that point. Now, he also went back again to Paul's, Apostle Paul's vision on the road to Damascus. We need to look at two things there. Number one, Paul had a physical implication because of what he saw. The idea is that he had a physical implication, number one. How can you say something to be a dream or just a mere vision when someone is blinded because of that? Add to that, Paul has that same narration, not in just one place, but in 2 or 3 separate places. We need to combine all of them together to get a conclusion. But my 2 minutes is over now. So my conclusion is, Paul, physical blindness, and therefore something which happened in physical reality. Not a dream, not a vision.
Right, so that's 5-2, 5-2. Now it's the other way, 5-2, 5-2, yeah?
Okay, so he gets another 5 minutes now?
Yeah.
I get 5 minutes, you can critique my case.
No, fine. I mean, if you're happy to just carry on, you've been talking for 2 minutes, okay, carry on. Okay, I want to answer your points though, because it doesn't seem natural to not answer your points.
We can, but the point is, if we keep on arguing like that, we won't proceed much. I need to advance my case.
Okay, no, fine. Advance away. Advance! I'll have to come back to your points then later on.
After we do 5
I think
5-2, we can.
Okay.
Now, I'd like to present a few, this is my 5 minutes where Paul would critique my case. I'd like to present a few very important things in Jesus' life. Very important things in Jesus' life. And here I present that in tabular form. And I'll read that out to you also. Which is, Jesus is a very popular Jewish name. But to speak about a very particular Jesus, the Jesus we care about, the Bible talks about that specific Jesus, whose brother was James, whose father was Joseph, mother was Mary, and so on. It gives additional details. And more importantly, this particular Jesus is uniquely identified by him being called the Christ. And that particular Jesus having disciples, extravagant claims about himself, new teaching, not just the Old Testament, but New Testament. Jesus himself said, I've come to give new wine in new wineskin. And then this Jesus did signs and wonders, miracles. In the day and age when people were even led to think the Messiah would never die, he would just live forever, where dying Messiah is an alien idea, this Jesus was accused, this Jesus offended Jewish leadership, and the Jewish leadership retaliated by planning to destroy him. The Jewish leadership accused him, and they took Jesus to the Romans, for the Romans to condemn him, and finally he was crucified. Now, when Jesus was crucified, there is the Bible also says nature itself responded to the crucifixion. And also later on, disciples come to believe in Jesus' resurrection. Disciples worship Jesus. And the early church was persecuted for all that we spoke about right now, especially for the fact of the disciples worshipping this person who they also claim to have died, who have been buried, and who rose up again back to life. And the early church grew right in Jerusalem, right beginning in the 1st century. Now, for these specific 16 points I raised, the Christian Gospels give detailed accounts. But add to the Christian Gospels in secular historical artifacts, and I've listed down numbers which I've given for them in my examination, we find secular historical artifacts attesting to every single point I have raised thus far. Amongst them, every single point addressed by secular historical artifacts also. In other words, for the particular Jesus of the Gospels who we read about, who I claim to be God, there is a very clear non-Christian historical attestation also for the same story. put both of them together, to deny Jesus Christ's death and resurrection is to deny some of the fundamental aspects we know about human history. And therefore, my dear friends, may I please commend to you, we need to grapple with the historical records which are at our disposal, Christian, Jewish, Roman, Greek, and to just name a few there, and perusing the following sources: Tacitus, Annals, chapter 15, verse 44, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book number 20, 9.1, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, 3.3, Pliny the Younger, Epistles, 10, 96, 25, Suetonius, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, book 5, 25.4, Suetonius, The Lives of 12 Caesars, book 6, 16.2, Lucian of Samosata, The Passing of Peregrinus, his work, Celsus, a Platonist philosopher, Babylonian Talmud, Thales, Phlegon, Africanus,
When is it your turn to
Jonathan
speak?
ben
Next week.
Uziel, writing the Targum, Jonathan. Put all of these things together, the Jesus of the Gospels could very easily be identified even without reading the Gospels. Not that I recommend you to do that, but even
It's
without
timed.
reading the Gospels, you can construct the entire crux of Jesus' life quite clearly. We all need to come back to Jesus Christ, who alone is able to save you and save me. Thank you.
Wow, very impressive. Thank you for that. Are you ready? So I get 2 minutes in response. Okay, let's just remind ourselves of the 2 points that I made initially. I'm going to Paul. I'm not going to anywhere else like Josephus or Suetonius or Tacitus or all the list of other people. None of them claimed to have seen the resurrected Jesus. The earliest one in the New Testament, the first person account, is Paul. None of the other witnesses are witnesses really. These are later people who have never even been to Jerusalem, most of these people. So what did our earliest witness say? He said in the 2 points, just to refresh our memories, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Jewish scriptures, and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Jewish scriptures. And my friend here, as we know, about 7 minutes ago, exactly 7 minutes ago, went back to Psalm 16 to prove this from the Psalm. And although I wish him well, I'm afraid he has failed completely to provide that evidence. The bit about the Holy One can also be translated the Faithful One, as it is in the NRSV. And it's in the first person. David says, "Therefore my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. For you do not give me up to Sheol." You do not give me up to Sheol. David is speaking about himself. It is not a prophecy of a future event. He's not talking about the Messiah. It's not a future resurrection from the grave. It's a poetic way of saying, you did not give me over to darkness or to evil. Okay, David is speaking in the first person, so that obviously cannot be a prophecy. Secondly, I will just read the passage in Acts where Paul says that people with him saw nothing. Remember, this is a bodily resurrection, allegedly, but in Acts chapter 9, verse 7, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard a voice, but they saw no one. The Christian claim is that there was a bodily resurrection of Jesus, but in fact it was a vision in the subjective mind of Paul, and no one with him saw a thing. Therefore, it did not happen as a bodily resurrection. That is my case.
Okay, I recommend it to our dear friend Paul that he'd have 5 minutes to advance his case, and now is the turn where I am advancing my case. I expected Paul to critique my case, not advance his own case, which hasn't happened, unfortunately. But just to quickly comment, Paul, our friend Paul here, comfortably just missed out the portion of scriptures I very much care about, which is beyond. David said, "For you will not leave my soul in Sheol," I agree, but he went on to say, "Nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption."
Which verse?
No, the same verse, the second half.
10.
Nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption.
Oh, yeah.
Crucial part. How can, obviously David was talking about a case where the person could be corrupted, but he is not allowed to see that corruption. And that is Davidic description of the body being in the grave, which is very qualified to be corrupt, but which was not allowed to be corrupt, just like how it happened in the case of not David. It didn't happen in the case of David. David saw corruption, and that was entire Apostle Peter's case. And therefore, this must be a prophecy from David. Now moving on to my case. Paul comfortably ignored the case that I advanced.
Sorry, we're just arguing about how long you're having. Are you having 5 minutes again now, are you?
Yeah, this is his
I
second
beg your
one.
pardon. Okay,
You had
sorry.
2 lots of 5
Okay,
minutes.
sorry.
This is his second lot of 5 minutes.
Give him an extra 10 minutes. It's 10 seconds. Sorry, my apologies for interrupting. I got confused.
That's fine. Now, Paul comfortably ignored the case that I was trying to advance here. I'd like him to critique the case I'm advancing. Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Younger, Josephus, these are the people I'd like Paul to speak about. Now, nowhere did I say these people were direct witnesses. Nowhere did I say that. For instance, Tacitus was a Roman senator who lived between 56 and 118 AD. Of course, he was born after Jesus ascended up to the heaven, but he was a Roman senator who had Roman records at his disposal. And that Tacitus, with the Roman records available to him, testifies, and he says, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea. 2 things I'd like to point out. Someone who had access to resources talks about 2 specific things here. Number 1, he testified that Jesus was killed, undergone death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of procurator Pontius Pilatus. Jesus was certainly killed. And he goes on to talk about something which he terms as pernicious superstition. Pernicious superstition. And the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, the home of the disease. Pernicious superstition, which he describes as a disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a walk. Now, the context is this. Tacitus wasn't just a Roman senator. History also tells us that Tacitus was a Roman priest. I can give you details. In AD 88, Tacitus became a member of the board of 15 for performing sacrifices atop an elite club of priests. And Tacitus was one of those 15 elite priests in the Roman way of worshipping God. Now, what would someone who has his own pantheistic worldview, all sorts of gods, stones are gods, these are gods, all sorts of created things are gods, woods are God, and so on, for him to speak about something as pernicious superstition? We would term his ideas as superstition. But that man claims, in his view, whatever happened to Jesus or whatever was claimed by the Christians themselves was pernicious superstition. He didn't stop there. He even termed that as a disease. And I'd like to comment before you, my dear friends, the exotic resurrection in the eyes of even a Roman priest would look a bit far-fetched. And that's precisely what Tacitus was testifying about. In the 1st century, Tacitus records this specific pernicious superstition began in Judea, was checked briefly in Judea, but later on broke out, going into the rest of the world also. My dear friends, resurrection employed to me by Tacitus, but certainly crucifixion. That's the kind of historical records I'd like our friend Paul to deal with. Not ignore, not ridicule, deal with it, please.
How long do I get? I get some time, do I?
2, yeah.
Good. Just checking. Okay, 2 points really. I'll just come back to your revisiting of Psalm 16 verse 10 and read it here again. Remember, the first person, the author, the speaker is David, King David, no one else. It says in verse 10, "For you did not give me up to Sheol." You did not me up to Sheol. It's not a future prophecy. It's not talking about anyone else. It's not talking about Jesus. Thousands of years later, you did not give me up to Sheol, nor let...
So, by reading that specific narration which Paul had, Paul, in the narration of what happened to him, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around from heaven. Paul did not describe a vision there. He says that light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice. So it wasn't just a light, it was also a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So Paul is seeing a light, he is hearing a voice, and he had fallen down already. And Paul responds back. He did not say, I'm just seeing a vision, I can't interact, but he is interacting. He says, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goats. So he, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And the Lord said to him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless. Our friend Paul here said the friends did not experience anything. Let me please correct him by reading the very passage he read, where it clearly says, and the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice. The men around him did not see the light, but they heard a voice, but seeing no one. As a matter of fact, if we combine this with the other,
which was my point,
with the other place where Paul gives a detail about this, the idea is they did not see a face, but they heard a light and heard a sound. Everyone experienced, more crucially Paul. Sorry, I took more time.
No, that's fine. I don't mind that. I suggest there has to be
time.
some limit to even so. Thank you for that. Good. That's quite a strong response, which I respect. I respect that. I'm going to make a controversial, polemical point now, which may not go down very well, but it needs to be said from my point of view. My friend here is using the King James Bible. The King James Bible, as any academic will tell you, if you study this academically, is not a translation you use because it's out of date, and most importantly, it's been heavily corrupted, particularly in the Old Testament. It's incorporating Christian ideas. It's given Christian translations of the Hebrew, which are not in the Hebrew. And there are many examples of this, unfortunately, and my friend has just given one. And he was controversial, it's not very popular, but I wanted to say that because modern translators now, mainstream ones, like the NRSV, are aware of this bias in the older translations. And they know, and they have corrected the mistranslations and the tendentious interpretations of the Jewish Bible. And now they give more accurate translations. And I want to share with you probably the most accurate translation of all. And that's where you get a difference between what we're saying. I'm quoting from the most accurate academic modern translation. He is quoting from a translation which has been interpolated by Christian scholars in the 16th century, when most people didn't know any better. So when it says in Psalm 16, when he says, it says the Holy One shall not see corruption, and it's talking about someone else, in the modern Bible, which doesn't have these Christian biases, it says this: therefore my heart is glad and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure. Therefore you do not give me up to Sheol, nor let your faithful one see the pit. So the first person is not there in his older Christianized Hebrew Bible, but it is here in my modern, more neutral, academic, objective and scholarly translation. But this is very convenient for Christians because they can read Christian theology out of it, because the translators in English have already spun it for them. I knew it was a bit controversial. I've said my piece. So now coming back to your other point, and I'm surprised you make your point for me. He quotes the road to Damascus again, and he says Paul had a vision, saw a light. Of course he does. And Paul hears a voice. Yes, he does. And then, but the men saw no one. Even in his King James version, the men saw no one. And that's my point. Jesus rose from the dead. He appeared to one man. Everyone else with him saw nothing. What kind of resurrection is that? It's not a resurrection that you should base a world religion on, where you trust the visionary experiences of a man that no one else can share. No one else saw what Paul saw. And yet a religion is based on this. How can we base it on an experience that no one else can share? This is not a very solid foundation.
Because we trust him, the debate.
Because you're Christians, yes, I know, yeah. So that is my view of the weakness of today's gospel message, that it's based on a visionary experience that no one else saw, that was only experienced in Paul's mind. I don't doubt he had it, but we could base all sorts of religions on visionary experiences and say it's from God. It's not a very objective, historically sound foundation to base a religion on. Therefore, we should not base our lives on it. We cannot base our children and our homes and our souls on an experience that we cannot have ourselves, because Jesus is now gone to heaven. He's no longer resurrected, he's now gone to heaven. So I'm afraid that the argument for the resurrection of Jesus is surprisingly weak, and I give up my minute to you.
Okay. Thank you for that generous gesture.
No.
Okay.
How are you?
Now,
Hello.
how many minutes?
Oh, hello.
Now, our dear friend Paul now runs and hides behind evaluation by modern day scholars about English translation
Yep.
of some Old Testament prophecies. I'd like to comment before him. We can discuss in detail about all sorts of translations if you want to, but maybe at a later date. Today, for sake of simplicity, may I please comment before our friend Paul, maybe we don't even need the English translations. We'd go back to the Greek wordings and the Greek evaluation of first century apostles. And I'm going to read to you from Acts chapter 2, continuing with where Peter introduced this idea. Verse 29, or maybe I should do verse 27. For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. According to him, it's not corruption, it's something else. Maybe, may not be. But Peter goes on, skipping a verse there, I'm going to verse 29. Men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would rise up the Christ to sit on his throne. He, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of the Christ. In other words, we could go to the underlying Greek text which Peter used in this case, as recorded by Luke, a physician, in the book of Acts, and their point, ignoring King James, ignoring any other translation, quite clear, someone who is dead could not have satisfied this, and therefore this is not talking about King David himself, but rather Messiah prophetically. Number one. Number two, our friend Paul here, in reference to the experience of Apostle Paul, over and over again makes a mistake. He says it's a vision. Oh, would you like a tea?
No, it's very kind, but no thank you. Maybe you like a tea?
No.
He's a bit busy actually, but thank you, yes.
Our friend Paul, he essentially said the Apostle Paul just saw a vision. And to stress that point, he stresses on the one aspect of his experience, which is that just that he saw something no one else saw. I'd like to expand the case. My dear friend, Paul saw a light. He didn't describe that as a vision. And he heard a sound. And everyone else around him heard the sound also. And what it says there, the verse does not say they did not see the light, but it rather says they did not see anyone. In other words, they could not see any perceivable face there. It doesn't say they did not even see the light, just that they did not see anyone, a human being there. Now, my dear friend, and therefore, summing that up, the point is, Paul's experience was a real experience involving light and sound, which was experienced by the other people also, and he even became blind because of that. Right. Thank you.
Did they see the light as well?
Well,
Please don't interrupt.
I'll read the passage.
Please don't interrupt. Thank you.
Okay, back to Acts 26, where Paul, according to Luke, is telling King Agrippa about his experience on the road to Damascus that my Christian friend here has just been talking about. And Paul says this to King Agrippa in verse 19. Acts 26, verse 19. I was not, King Agrippa, disobedient to the heavenly vision. So he does call it a vision, contrary to what you claim. If we're to trust the Bible, maybe it's not true, but at least the Bible says it was a vision. Coming back then to the actual, the story you just mentioned here in Acts 9, The men who were travelling with Paul stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Now the point about the resurrected Jesus is, he was a bloke walking around who'd been dead. They would have seen him if he'd been resurrected from the dead. That's the whole point. There's not any obscure thing about did they see a light or not. They saw no one. They should have seen a flesh and blood human being walking around. They saw nothing. And it was a heavenly vision, and it was Paul's own resurrection appearance. And Paul says in Acts 1 Corinthians 15, he appeared to Peter, to James, to everyone else, and last of all, he appeared to me. So we know, I would argue, that all of the appearances were visions. To Peter, to James, to the 500, they were all visions. And how can this be, you say? How can people have collective visions? But they do. Ask in Portugal, in Fatima, go to Medjugorje, go to other places where Mary has appeared to thousands of people. Just Google it. I've looked it up. Collective, massive hallucinations of dead people happen in the 20th century. I'm not surprised it happened thousands of years ago in a backwater of the Roman Empire. It does not surprise me in the slightest. Then he quotes Peter in Acts 2. I'm sorry, but usually when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it alters the translation. It twists and turns and makes things up. And the most notorious case that biblical scholars will tell you about is Hebrews chapter 10, which is actually talking about the incarnation of God, the incarnation of the Son. Sacrifice and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. Oh, sorry. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, and then there's a quote from the Psalm, sacrifice and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. So a body has been prepared for Jesus. Wow, and it's quoting from a Psalm, a prophecy, surely. But no. All you've got to do is you check it in the Old Testament, look up the Psalm, and guess what? It doesn't mention a body. It mentions an ear. It's really weird. Thank you. An ear. Because what scholars will tell you, the New Testament is quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which itself is a bad translation of the Hebrew original. The New Testament is quoting from a bad translation, which sometimes gets the original Hebrew wrong, badly wrong. I reference you to James Barr, Professor of Hebrew at Oxford University, in his monograph on this very subject, which I've read and studied. Hebrews gets it wrong, and it quotes a bad translation. But of that bad translation, you have made doctrine and a false prophecy. It's not there in the Hebrew Bible. And this is typical, I'm afraid, of the New Testament. Thank you. You may respond to that.
Thank you very much. Okay, assertions repeated, no explanation given. The point was pretty simple in regards to Paul. Now,
but you just said vision.
Excuse me. Our friend Paul now made a huge leap, which I was very surprised to see. He said, Paul says it's a vision, and therefore everyone else saw visions.
Yes.
Now, I'm curious. If everyone else saw visions, what explains the empty tomb? What explains the fact that Jews in the first century, according to the book of Matthew, according to Matthew himself, had to find an empty tomb, and the only explanation they could come up with was that the disciples stole the body and they were trying to spread around a lie. Now, this in the context of few things, which is number one, Roman soldiers guarding the tomb. Number two, expert religious Jewish people were on the case on top of the Romans. And number three, body not found. There's only one thing which can explain all these three combined together, which is Jesus had risen up. Whether you'd like to describe what Paul saw as a vision or not, that's a secondary thing. Jesus had risen up purely outside of Paul's experiences. Also, empty tomb, while the guards were guarding the tomb, when the Jewish leadership was also on the case. Nothing else can explain apart from the fact that the body had risen up from being dead. Now, going to his jump from, none of the other apostles saw Jesus in the bodily form. Unfortunately though, his conclusion was based on an idea, a logic which goes something like this. This is Paul's experience, and therefore everyone else had a similar experience.
Yes.
I'd like to clarify, excuse me my dear friends, Paul's experience was quite unique. Peter's experience and the rest of the apostles' experience was quite different. Peter and the apostle and the person who was called the man who Jesus loved went to an empty tomb. Peter had dinner with Jesus after he had risen up. Peter had seen Jesus ascend up into the heavens. And the angels responding by saying, why do you even look at this like this? Because the one who ascended up likewise is going to return back. In other words, apostles outside of Paul had varied experiences which could only be explained as experiences from a bodily resurrected Jesus Christ. And the same was seen by Mary Magdalene and many other people, as how Paul puts it, 500 people at one time. At even one specific time, 500 people. Now, my dear friends, the fact of the matter is Jesus' resurrection is fundamental to the Christians' belief. And it is for the fact that they saw this openly, honestly, in the way they could verify as bodily resurrection, they were willing to give up their lives. Thank you.
That was good. That was good. Thank you for that. About the empty tomb, this is something that biblical scholars, if you're familiar with the literature, have struck them as something very curious about this letter of Corinthians. Paul, as I say, is the earliest account we have of the resurrection appearances, doesn't mention an empty tomb. Interesting. There's no empty tomb mentioned in the earliest account of Jesus' death and resurrection. And some scholars, not all, have posited that the empty tomb idea is a much later tradition that entered into the Christian story years after Paul. It wasn't part of the original gospel belief. That's the first point. So we can't just assume it was there because Christians believe it's there. It's not mentioned, the empty tomb. Very interesting. And coming back to, you make actually a very good point. It's one that occurred to me some time ago. That was Paul's appearance of the resurrected Jesus the same as the others? Because you talk about, Peter had lunch or dinner or 11s or afternoon tea with Jesus, or something like that. But not afternoon tea. He was an Englishman. But the point is this: that where you're getting these stories from is from the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, well, not Matthew, because there's no resurrection appearances in Mark, rather, but in Matthew, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. These stories were written many, many years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. By the traditional dating, 1 Corinthians is written about AD 53, 54, and most scholars today would say Luke was written in the 80s or 90s. Same for Matthew, 80s or 90s. John, even later. We're talking 40 to 50 years later when these stories that you're now combining with Paul's account were actually written. And my theory, and I can't prove it, but as I say, my theory is, and you can disagree with it because there's no proof for it, but my theory is the earliest account we have is of a vision which no one else saw. That's what Paul says in Acts, if that's true. But later on, as religious stories do, as myths develop, they become embellished, they get told again, and details are added in the stories. And we can see this in the way Matthew has used Mark even. He adds bits of story in which weren't there in Mark. So I would suggest in the history of religion sense, in the sense of the academic study of all religions, we are used to seeing the embellishment and development of legends around religious figures who are really, really important. And Christianity is no exception to this rule. We see an early vision, thank you, turning into a much more physical story 30, 40, 50, 60 years after 1 Corinthians. And I would say that that is most likely to have happened here. The early tradition makes no reference of an empty tomb. The Gospels do, but they're written much, much, much later. And therefore, the question has to be asked, is this a result of legendary embellishment and development, or is it history? And I would say it's the former rather than the latter. Thank you, Douglas.
In terms of dealing with history, our friend Paul here advances a very dangerous idea. He says the earliest account matters and whatever else is not supposed to be as reliable as the earliest one. I'd like to think that is not the way historians look at historical records. If that were the case, you shouldn't even be looking at 1 Corinthians, you should only be looking at the epistle that Paul wrote to Thessalonians, because that's the first epistle that Paul wrote according to some historians. The fact of the matter is this, my dear friend. If my friend were to die, if your friend and my friend were to be buried, and if your friend and my friend, we know where he was buried, and if he wasn't in the grave on the third day, and if we saw him alive on the third day going forward for many days, and then finally also we see him ascend into heaven, how long would we remember that in our lifetimes? That's what I'd like to ask. For our friend Paul here to suggest that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are not reliable because that was written years after 1 Corinthians? My dear friend, I would, if I saw my friend die and come back alive, I would remember that for my entire life. Entire life, not 10 years, not 15 years, my entire life. Now let me read to you Matthew. Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. Very physical experience, the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. That is a very physical experience that is recorded by Matthew. And then the angel says, the topic that our friend Paul here gave, he is not here, he is risen. He is risen. Record by Matthew. Now, if such a very dramatic thing happened in your life, how long would you remember? Our friend Paul here thinks maybe for not long. I'd like to think to the contrary. And therefore, I'd like to comment to you every single writing which is written by witnesses or people who are close to Jesus' life, for us to take every one of them seriously. That's where we get our ideas from. He also suggested that the resurrection, the resurrection, the resurrection idea was an embellished idea which evolved to be true bodily resurrection after quite a while. Unfortunately, though, that is not consistent with the historical records that I had pointed out to you earlier. I had pointed out to you earlier that the early church was persecuted right in Jerusalem, right during or before the time of Tacitus, enough to an extent Tacitus records it. And the early church grew right in Jerusalem according to Tacitus himself. And Tacitus, we know, died in 110, around 110 AD. So the fact of the matter is, by 110 AD, you have church rise up, being persecuted, and then rise up again and go into the wider parts of the world. His ideas do not match up to that evidence we see. Final one. Is he doing the final one?
Okay, it is, right, okay. Fine, jolly good. Well, that changes things because I was going to, okay. In that case, I'd like, is that 3 minutes? 3 minutes is long enough, that's okay. Right, okay, this is the last point I can make apparently. So, just say very quickly, it's now the consensus of virtually all modern scholars that Matthew, for example, is not a first-person eyewitness account. It was written in the second generation, long after Jesus, by an unknown Jewish Christian writer. Likewise, Luke's not an eyewitness, obviously. John, well, we don't know who wrote the Gospel of John, it's anonymous. Mark, we don't know who wrote Mark, it doesn't claim to be, none of the Gospels claim to be eyewitnesses, and that is, so we can't rely on them as somehow, oh, I remember in my youth, Jesus said this to me. That's not how modern scholars understand it, and even conservative scholars say the same thing. About the embellishment issue, I'll just give two examples. In Mark, the earliest gospel, according to most scholars, we have Mary being spoken of as an unbeliever. In Mark chapter 3, she is one of those, in verse 21, who went out to restrain Jesus because he is out of his mind. And in verse 31, the mothers and brothers came and they sent to him, calling him to come out. And Jesus said, but who are my mother and my brothers? You are my mothers and brothers who are sitting with me. Very distancing. And then, but notice, by the 2nd century, Mary has been called the Mother of God. And today, most Christians call Mary the Queen of the universe, the spouse of the Holy Spirit. Now, you may shake your head, and I agree with you, it is a terrible thing, but these are most Christians today. So we see a extraordinary trajectory from a very lowly, she's an unbeliever in Mark, to today, she's virtually the fourth person of a quaternity, a Trinity plus one. So I think we can see religious development on an incredible scale. Let me give you a final example of the embellishment that is universally seen as a made-up story in the Gospel of Matthew. It's called, I call it, the zombie apocalypse. Yes. The zombie apocalypse. Okay, this is quite well known. Now, this takes place at the death of Jesus on the cross. Okay, and it's only found, I'll tell you why this is significant. I'll just tell you what the verse says. It's in 2 verses. At the moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After the resurrection, they came out of the tombs. After their resurrection, they came out of the tombs, entered the holy city and appeared to many. Wow, the zombies are alive. They walk around Jerusalem. They appear to their families. Now, what is odd about this public event in Jerusalem in broad daylight, where many, many people walk around, is that no one else in recorded history anywhere has ever heard of this event. Acts doesn't mention it. Thank you. Acts doesn't mention it. Josephus, Tacitus, Luke, Matthew rather, Mark, Paul. No one mentions this. Surely this is more fantastic, more amazing than even the alleged resurrection of Jesus, because these were zombies who walked around Jerusalem, and yet there's no corroborating evidence. This almost certainly, according to the vast majority of scholars, is a legend that's made up. Even someone like Mike Licona, thank you, I'll have another 15 seconds if you don't mind. Mike Licona, the famous American apologist, evangelical, he admits that this is probably not historical. If Matthew can make this stuff up, what else did he make up? And my final point is this. It has not been demonstrated today, Paul's claim, thank you, that in the Jewish scriptures, the Messiah would die and rise again on the third day in accordance with the Jewish scriptures. I have read nowhere, and Jonah is not an example. Jonah, by the way, in the whale, Jonah did not die. He was alive throughout the whole experience. Yes. Jesus, in your belief, was dead. So Jonah cannot be the answer. But anyway, I could go on. I don't want to provoke yet more discussion. You may have the final word. Oh, I've had the final word. I've had the final word.
That's where I'm quite upset that you raise many new points.
Oh, but
in what was supposed to be a rebuttal time.
But you know, it was my fault because I didn't know it was my final time. So you may have the final word. You have the final word. Over to you, sir. You have the final word.
Just maybe quickly, one of the
as long as you need.
One of the logic that our friend Paul here uses. There is some embellishment about some things in history, and therefore everything else is embellishment. I'd like to say, if you apply the same logic, there are people who lie, and therefore everyone is a liar. There are people who kill, and therefore everyone is a killer. That doesn't work that way, does it? The point is, I'm not disagreeing that there are some embellishments, even about characters which are portrayed in the Bible. I agree. Mary being worshipped, I don't like that. It's not historical as far as I see. But that does not mean Jesus, the life of Jesus, has also been embellished. Now, about earthquakes, now we have sources Thales, Phlegon, and Africanus mention about the supernatural event of the earthquake, and then commenting about that later. So we see that. So I'd like to finally commend before us all, my dear friends, Christian friends of Jesus, Roman non-Christian disciples, historians, Jewish non-Christian historians, Greek non-Christian historians, all of them testifying for bodily resurrection being believed by Christians who were even willing to lay down their lives. We need to explain those fundamental things for us to navigate through this difficult terrain. What explains an empty tomb? What explains persecution of the body of the church in the first century, right there in Jerusalem, and people willing to go through it, and the growth of the church beginning with Jerusalem and moving on quite quickly through vast other portions of the Roman Empire in the first century. What explains these things is very crucial for us to understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very civilized debate. Thank you very much, sir. You're a good chap. Thank you. Thank you, the director here, Mr. Director. Yeah, very good. And Douglas, who did the timing so perfectly. Thank you, Douglas.
We discuss that later.
Same thing you talk. Same thing.
Yeah, I know. Standing around doing nothing. Sorry, I'm holding.
Come two angels. That's the question. How many angels were there?
Except there's been some embellishment. He exceeded that.
No, I said embellishment in regards to Mary.
So
Oh, you see, I thought you meant in the Bible.
Right.
Oh,
What
I
about
see.
this
Okay.
then? One angel or two angels? Was so who's telling the truth? Angel means
If there are two, there should be one.
Maybe that witness
If there are two, there should be one, shouldn't it?
Thank you. It's all over.